My name is Kevin Boyle, and I teach modern American history at Northwestern University. And my primary research interest has been on modern American social movements. So I have written about the 20th century labor movement. I've written on the 20th century civil rights movement. I've written on radical movements. That's been the work that I've done over the years. I think all of us know at some level or another that the present and the past are connected. We know that about our own lives. We know that about our families, who our parents were, our grandparents were, matter to us because they shape who we are. And that's true of societies as well, that what happened in our past shapes our present. And the more we understand the complexities of the past, the better we have an understanding of how we got to our present moment. I think that's really the essence of history. One of the things that I've done over the years in my career is I've taught a number of courses, particularly on the civil rights movement. And students come into those courses, and I've given public lectures to groups of people, of adults as well over the years. And people come into those lectures and they think that they know the kind of they understand things like the civil rights movement in particular, right? They have a sense that they know what that movement is. And they do, they know part of what that movement is. But what we can do as historians, and I think historians have done a really extraordinary job doing, is saying, yeah, that's good. It's good that you know about, and it is good, I don't mean it in a snarky sort of way at all, that you know about Rosa Parks, that you know about Martin Luther King, that you know about the I Have a Dream speech. That's important stuff, but there's so much more to the Black experience in the United States. And what we can do as historians is we can, not just civil rights, obviously, though that's important to me, we can, as historians, we can expand that out in so many ways. We can help people understand, students, general readers, other academics, the full massive complexity of the Black experience. And the way that we can do that is by exploring, well, it goes two ways really, that we can take deeper dives into those episodes that we think we do know. And there's been some really important, wonderful work on doing exactly that. So I think, for instance, of some of the terrific books that have appeared, say, in the last 10 years or so about Malcolm X. You understand Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam so much more deeply now because historians have done deep dives into a movement that people, and a person who people think they knew. And then the other way of doing it is that you can go into incidents, events, dynamics that people don't know. And by doing that, you give a much more deep sense of the complexity of the past. And that's what ties us then to the complexity of the present. When I teach that civil rights course, that's what it's called. It's called the Modern Civil Rights Movement or something like that. What I try to do is extend the history way back. Now, I know as historians, we look at that and we think, well, yeah, that's what now has become the standard way to understand the civil rights movement, that it's no longer this short movement that people, but the students don't know that. Students don't have that sense. So that's one way of doing it. I got an email this morning from a student who I had, a first-year student who I had last quarter in a class called Protest. And what we really did was, it was a team-taught course, and I taught a portion of it on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, that segment of the movement. And then my co-teacher was a specialist in the subcontinent of Indian history. And so she did a whole thing on Gandhi and on the Dalit movements. Anyways, I got an email today from a student who said, I just heard this NPR story about Bayard Rustin. And that really reminded me of the class because he had never heard of Bayard Rustin before. So that's one way of expanding out the history in the classroom. The other way, and it's the way that my scholarship has gone, is to say, as we expand out the history of the civil rights movement, for me, that's been, again, my focus, and of the racial dynamics of American society in the 20th century, to look at incidents and events that haven't gotten the attention they deserve. So I wrote a book on a racial event in 1925 Detroit. When I wrote that book, I knew about that event, and folks in Detroit, which is my hometown, a lot of people had a kind of vague notion of that event, but people outside of those circles did not know about that event. Now, what I felt I was trying to do was get that event and the dynamics it explored, which is really the important thing, into the history books. And with Picturing Black History, what I tried to do was, I really wanted to write about the politics of busing particularly in the 1970s, which again, people know about, obviously. Lots of people were involved in one way or another in those politics, but it's not part of the history that reaches beyond it hasn't been completely incorporated into the history of the movement to the extent that I think it ought to be. So what I try to do is look for those moments that kind of reveal bigger dynamics that need more attention. I really love linking history with images. I think it's such a powerful thing. And Getty obviously has this incredible archives, and I've loved Origins for a very long time. I wrote an essay for Origins a number of years ago that I still, I'm really proud of, actually. It feels weird to say that, but I'm really proud of that essay. So it was kind of this perfect marriage, right? The minute I saw it, I thought, oh, pictures, Origins, Getty, this is so cool. And then I did it kind of in the opposite way that I often deal with images. I knew I wanted to write about busing. And so what I did was I went through looking for a really good photo about busing. And the reason I wanted to write about busing is that I am convinced that busing, the idea of busing, is actually the most radical. I don't want to overstate it, but I don't want to understate it either. It's one of the most radical moments in the American Civil Rights Revolution. And we never think of it that way, because what we do as historians, and I do it too, is we tend to think of radicalism in the obvious ways, right? That we think of radicalism as being connected with what the 20th century defined as radicalism, communism, socialism, or in Black history, Black nationalism, which in the late 60s becomes embodied in movements like, say, the Panthers, right? Which is, of course, linked to Marxism in various ways. And it is radical. I'm not trying to say it isn't. I'm just trying to say there's ways that you can expand our concept of radicalism. And this one we don't think of as radical because it really comes out of an organization, the NAACP, who we don't think of as radical. We think of as kind of the opposite, right? But the reason that I think it's so radical is that so much of really the entire burden of racial activism and racial change in this country fell on Black people. They were the ones who had to kind of bear the weight of racial change. That's true to this day, obviously. What busing did, or tried to do is a better way of putting it, is to say, you know what? White people have to bear that weight too. And that's one of the reasons that it had such massive blowback, that I do not want, under any circumstances, to try to narrow down the accomplishments of African-American activism in the 1960s. There is sweeping change that people put in place. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty. Those are really important things. And I am not trying to minimize them, but the truth of it is that for a lot of those changes didn't directly impact white people living, say, out in the suburbs of Chicago or in the suburbs of Columbus. It didn't touch their lives. They saw it on TV. Oftentimes, at least a portion of those white people supported those changes. But it wasn't saying to them, you know what, you have a responsibility too for racial change. Busing did. And that's what makes it so dramatic, so radical. It was a sweeping program of social engineering that said whites have to bear burdens too. And it is a burden, you're putting your kid on a bus and he's going across the town or whatever. It's a big deal. I'm not trying to minimize that. In fact, I'm doing the opposite. That's why I think it's important that we think about it. I decided that I wanted it to be a color photo. And so that kind of narrowed down the range of photos I could use. And what drew me to this photo was, first of all, the photo that I used centers a child. So it's a Black child. And I wanted that. I wanted to make sure that the photo said, this was about children. It wasn't just adults involved here. And then the photo kind of juxtaposes the Black child actually getting on the bus to go home. That's labeled wrong. It says he's arriving. He's clearly not arriving. He's going home. And there's a policeman watching over him getting on the bus. And the reason that there's a policeman watching him getting on the bus is that this is in Louisville, when Louisville first implemented its busing program. And there was intense white violence. So intense white violence that the city and the state together decided that every single bus running in the second week of busing in the city was going to have an armed guard on it. And what this really highlighted for me was the intensity of the blowback, that here was this policy that was going to say white kids and Black kids are both going to be bearing this burden. But because of the intensity of that white resistance, the burden went back on the Black kids. And this was a visualization of that. I don't mean at all to reduce Black history to the civil rights movement. Obviously, it's so broader and so richer than that. It's just what I focus on because I focus on social movements. But I think it's so important to realize that the struggle for racial justice encompassed so many people, including children. In fact, children are pivotal to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. This was really, really hard to put kids in that position. And to this day, now adults, well, even aging adults at this stage, right? Both Black kids and white kids will talk about their experience of being bused in a way that gives you a sense of how great that burden was. Now, I'll go off in a slightly expansive direction. I recently wrote a book on the 1960s, and what I tried to do was personalize the experience of the 1960s. And one of the stories that I told to start the chapter that begins the story of civil rights activism is Elizabeth Eckford in Little Rock in 1957. And what I really wanted to drive home was both the courage. She's one of the Little Rock Nine, and she is the member of Little Rock Nine who didn't get the information about coming together into the school the first day. They never got into the school. And so obviously. So what happened was that she showed up alone and walked through this massive white mob. And her experience of that was what I was trying to describe, because it is this incredible act of courage, and it is a beautiful and powerful symbol of the kind of moral power that the civil rights movement brought to bear. But it's also the story of a 15-year-old girl scared to death for good reason. And that's part of the story too. Civil rights activism is incredibly courageous, and it can be and often is incredibly costly. I do not remember that there was any marker of Black History Month in my schools when I was growing up. Obviously, Black History Month had been around an awfully long time before, not that old. So it had been around a good long time before I went to school. grade school and high school, but I went to completely white schools. It was in a city that was increasingly, the population was increasingly African American in Detroit. But my schools were completely white. Well, my grade school was completely white. My high school was overwhelmingly white. And there wasn't any recognition whatsoever that I remember of Black History Month. So I actually have a hard time pinpointing when, not a hard time, I can't pinpoint exactly when I first kind of encountered Black History Month. My guess is that it was in college. I went to the University of Detroit, which is a small college in the city of Detroit in a completely Black neighborhood and the school itself had actually quite high, I don't know the percentage, but quite high percentage of African American students. So my guess is that it was there, but I can't even swear by that. I have, not every year, obviously, but because I have done some work on the civil rights movement, I've done my share of talks in February as various organizations kind of contact you and say, we'd love to have a speaker. And I'm sure there's a giant list of speakers, and I'm like way down at the bottom of that list. Like, you have failed to get everybody else you want, and you have come to me. But that has been kind of the most common way for me to engage with Black History Month. I think that it is more relevant now than it has been in decades, because it's true that Black History Month has become much more visible than it was, back in the ancient days of my schooling for folks like me, right? For kids who are going to completely white schools, it's harder now for places, and there's a lot of completely white schools in this country to this day. We've actually moved backwards in terms of integration of schools. So it's important that Black History Month kind of pushes Black history onto a curriculum that I suspect wouldn't engage with it. Obviously, one of the big criticisms over the years is, well, why are you limiting it to 1 month? And I profoundly believe that. I agree with that. But right now, in the moment that we're living in, I'm not sure that's the alternative. I don't think the alternative is, for a lot of schools, obviously not every school, but for a lot of schools, I don't think the alternative is either we incorporate Black history across the curriculum or we do it in 1 month. My fear is the opposite, that there is enormous political pressure to not engage with Black history at all, because somehow it does. It makes white people uncomfortable, which is one of the points of history. History is not about making everyone feel comfortable. It's about giving us a sense of how difficult and how complex the past is. And in the United States, that has to be centered on race. It's not to say there aren't other issues. Of course, there are other issues. It has to be centered on race. But what we're doing, what the political pressure is doing, is it's pushing teachers who are in a very difficult spot to want to do less. And what I hope is that Black History Month is a way to kind of prevent that pressure from overwhelming the curriculum entirely. The visibility that you see, the ads that you're going to see on the Super Bowl, right? Or the embrace of Black history in other media is, at this moment, this really difficult, depressing moment, it serves as a backstop, right? A way of pushing back against this drive to eliminate the discussions of race by centers of power, right? That corporate support is problematic in some ways, and what it often does is it reifies those standard stories we know, right? That I'll take that over no support at all, because that's one way that you can stop this push down on the ground in the classroom to eliminate race somehow from the curriculum. We are obviously a multiracial society, and we are growing an increasingly multiracial society, partly by processes of immigration, partly, which I find really fascinating, processes of redefinition as communities start to redefine their own identity in racial terms, which is a really fascinating process. And all of that history of racial tensions, of racial transformations, of racial structures, we need all of that. But of those multiple racial identities and the complexities of America as a multiracial society, the central fault line still remains the Black-white fault line. And what Black History Month does is say, no one's trying to deny that this is a multicultural society, that Black history has a particularly important place. And it has a particularly important place, partly because Black people are a substantial portion of the American population. They have always been the largest non-white group in the United States, so very recently, the largest non-white group in the United States. But more importantly, it's that Black-white divide is the relationship, the place of Black Americans has defined so much the nature of American society. And what Black History Month does is make, and these current debates, right? Those are debates about Black history. There have been times, certainly, where ethnic studies have come under attack as well. But this current moment, this is about Black history. This is overwhelmingly about Black history. And what Black History Month does is anchor that particular aspect of the American, and that fundamental aspect of the American racial regime, where I think it needs to be anchored. And I'll just add one last point. Again, my interest has been on civil rights activism. But that's not the totality of Black history. And the totality of Black history is not purely about racism, though racism informs the Black experience in, obviously in fundamental ways. But there's all sorts of dynamics inside the Black experience that we need to explore. So this conversation, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, has focused on that aspect of Black history, but it's so important to stress that is not the totality. It isn't even close to the totality of Black history. I would love more and more of general students, general audience, general readers, interested people more broadly, to look at the ways in which Black history plays out for ordinary people, the ways in which it reaches into all those fascinating communities that exist across the country, that exist across time. And there's great historical scholarship that does that. I would love that to get more kind of crossover into Black History Month in somebody's high school, or Black History Month in somebody's grade school. And I'm sure it happens, but I would like to see it happen more. I'd love people to get a sense of what was life like for ordinary people in all its complexity, down on the ground where most of us, the vast majority of us, live our lives. So obviously there is a huge fight going on over over the term critical race theory. I actually think that education would actually, and it's such a false flag argument. You know, I was just giving a talk, a guest lecture in one of our classes last week. Well over, somewhere around 60% of Americans have no idea what critical race theory is. People are all upset about it. As of last summer, 30% of Americans had never heard the words critical race theory put together. We would actually benefit from more teaching of critical race theory in our classrooms. Not in it's a complex concept. But that's our job as educators, is to take complex concepts and to apply them in appropriate ways for the students, the level we're at. We need a greater understanding of the structural forces of race. That so much of the, it's the kind of one of the many perverse pieces of this current moment, right, of controversy is that the white pushback has been, don't make us feel bad. You're saying I'm a racist. The argument is the opposite. Not that you're not is that the force of race is its way that it has infused the structures of society. Now, that's not to excuse people's individual behavior, but it's to try to explain how society becomes structured by race. And I'm not saying you should delve into all the particulars of that in your fourth grade classroom. Good luck with that. My daughter teaches fifth grade. I have some sense of what we're talking about in a fifth grade classroom. But there are ways to approach, especially with high schoolers, you can approach high schoolers that way to understand the connections between structures and individual action in the past. That's what I'd like to see us do more of that all the way through the curriculum. Not, it's so easy to reduce race in the past to, well, there were some bad people out there. And there were some bad people out there. I'm not trying to say there weren't, but to understand how it fits into a structure of race, that's really, I'd love to see things move in that direction.